Hello all, Dr. JC here, Lecture 4. I'm going to be talking specifically about ancient Greece and this concept known as Hellenism in the wake of Alexander the Great as well. Prior to getting into ancient Greece specifically, we're going to look in particular at two city-states there, Athens and Sparta. Wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about the Mycenaean world. Now, Mycenae is a city-state itself. If you look on the map, that sort of island area to the south and west, you can see Mycenae located there. Mycenae is a city-state. It became the center of the Greek world. They helped replace Minoan civilization. Minoans that preceded the Mycenaeans were the dominant maritime power of the region and generally located on the Isle of Crete, with their prominent capital city on Knossos on the Isle of Crete. But the Mycenaeans will come to become the leading city-state, hence Mycenaean civilization named after their city-state. Rather than going too in-depth about the Mycenaean world, if you're interested, I'd ask that you research it, Google it more yourself. I did want to posit this question for consideration for everyone. What are the strengths, perhaps, and shortcomings of decentralized nation-states or civilizations? So you say, well, what does that mean? What's decentralized nation-states or civilizations? What I mean by decentralized structure is that it's lacking a central location or power. As in the United States today, you have a federal government, but you also have different individual states within that structure as well. The federal government, however, does provide a sort of overarching glue that brings the states together. In the Mycenaean world and Greek world, this will be absent. There's not a centralized power. It's the same as in Mesopotamia. So you have different individual city-states that are the power themselves. Therefore, what are the strengths and potential shortcomings of a decentralized governmental structure? I want you to consider that as we move forward. Now, in the Mycenaean world, as in the Greek world, and we'll turn to Athens and Sparta next in the Greek world, each of these city-states were known as a polis, polis meaning literally city in Greek. Each city-state generally had a marketplace known as an agora, an amphitheater as depicted in the picture near the bottom on this slide for entertainment and sport. They generally had an acropolis, which is that area to the top of the picture here for spiritual reasons. If you wanted to speak with the oracles and then the gods, you would go visit this place. And generally most of them had harbors too if they were associated by the sea. That said, each different individual city-state, while roughly constructed the same way, the underpinning culture was determined by the people itself. And we'll see the differences in culture when we talk about Athens and Sparta next. Before turning to Athens, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least make brief mention of the various forms of governance that are associated with the Greek world, largely because of their impact on America's founding governmental structure itself. Working in reverse order on this slide, we'll start with tyrants or dictators. These are individuals that generally come to power through irregular or illegal means. They will seize power, usually in what the French would call a coup d'etat, or a quick seizure of power. Therefore, their rule is perhaps illegitimate. By contrast, an oligarchy is a rule by few. This would be a small group of individuals that runs the show. Ancient Sparta will be a good example of that, as will other states in the Greek world. Lastly, this concept of a democracy or rule by the people comes from the Greek world as well. We'll see some examples of this in ancient Athens. And the latter here, democracy in some sense, does apply to the United States, even though the U.S. wasn't established to be a democratic system. It was a republic, meaning that only certain people could vote. It has tended to morph into more of a democracy today, for good or ill, depending on how one views democratic system. Thus, from the Greeks, we get various forms of governance here in governmental structures. My question for you, and it's not anything that needs to be answered in a forum, but I'd like you to consider it. Which of these forms of governance would you consider to be the best? Is a democracy the best? Rule by people? An oligarchy, or perhaps a king in the form of a tyrant? James Madison himself, one of the founding fathers, stated about democracy that as much damage can be done by an all-powerful people as an all-powerful prince. What did he mean by that? So I'd like for you to consider that yourself over the next few minutes, and then we'll continue on to Athens. While there are innumerable city-states throughout the ancient Greek world, Athens and Sparta were the two leading states. The Athenians tended to be more associated with arts and culture, democracy, writing, literature. Not to say that they didn't get into the military game. They had to. They built an expansive navy. But much more associated with what we might consider in the College of Arts and Sciences per se. Ancient Sparta, however, decidedly different. This is a true sort of military state itself. You would think of a war college if we'd associate ancient Sparta to modern day sort of academic institutions. With respect to the Athenians specifically, though, much press has been given rightfully to an individual by the name of Pericles. Often, if we're thinking about democracy in ancient Athens, we associate the name Pericles with that. That stated, often overlooked is Solon, and I think Solon, for all intents and purposes, is the individual that really posits this notion of democratic principles in Athens itself. Thus, for the Athenians, if they're looking for a way to try to create some sense of stability and order in a chaotic world, much like the Chinese through their philosophies of order, the Athenians are going to focus on democratic principles. Allow individuals from every class or station in life to have an opportunity to be represented in government, and at least they have a voice that way. So if they have a voice, they feel like, and a vote, they feel like that they're engaged and part of the fabric of what is Athens. And that's how Athenians would deal with change in a chaotic world, through democratic principles. Thus, if Athenians deal with change in a chaotic world through the use of the so-styled velvet glove, let's sit down and discuss things and have some tea and crumpets and, I don't know, group hug type thing, like we're all who's in Whoville singing around a Christmas tree. Spartans are going to deal with change in a chaotic world, and they're going to create order in a chaotic world with an iron fist. Now, you may have heard the old expression that if all anyone was ever given was a hammer in life, everything they would see would look like a nail, because they don't have any other tools in their tool belt. Ancient Sparta is much that way. Young boys, young girls, they were shaped from a very early age to focus on one thing, and that's warfare and the maintenance and perpetuation of a military state. Therefore, that's all they knew. And you say, well, how does this work then? How do we maintain a state if your boys that turn into men are off campaigning through military conquest most of the time? Who the hell's left at home to do the hard work? Well, that hard work was done by, guess what? Slaves. Spartan society was a slave society. Their underpinning economy required that they have a huge amount of helots or slaves to help do the menial labor. The question is, if the men are off campaigning, who's in control of this slave population? Enter the key, crucial, essential role of Spartan women in the military state. If the men are away on campaign, the women are required to run the household and maintain order of the slave or helot population. They will do that. So the other essential task that women will have in Spartan society is to do what? Well, procreate. Have new strong babies for the Spartan state. And the best way to have strong babies is to do what? Have strong young women. Therefore, the young women were often pulled away from their families just like the young men. Sometimes boys and girls, 6, 7, 8 years old, pulled away, sent to different schools to train. The boys trained in the military arts, the women trained in gymnastics, sporting events, all these necessary sorts of things to build a strong body. The thought process being, if we have strong women, strong bodies, we have what? Strong babies. So the role of women in Spartan society was absolutely essential, and I can't stress that enough. Now, before we press on to military innovation in the larger Greek world, I wanted to talk about one other aspect of Spartan society because I do think it gives us some example of the establishment of central control, bureaucratic control, how a military state is established. In some sense, that comes from this example of education. In ancient Sparta, A group of individuals known as ephors were elected annually to educate kids. Well, one question might be, and I have it posed here, why were there annual elections for ephors? I mean, if you had somebody that was like really good, dynamic, engaging, someone that the young boys and girls would be very interested in learning from, why not have them for like freaking 30 years, right? That was the point. When you have a military state, you don't want relationships being formed. You don't want young boys and girls potentially to wed their allegiance to an individual. Their allegiance is to the state. Therefore, ephors were brought in annually. This isn't to say that individuals couldn't come back in ephor. You just couldn't serve in consecutive terms. What the state wanted to do was maintain control of the education, the content, and most specifically the message. Young boys and young girls are to be trained X, Y, and Z for the state and the state only. Thus, the differences between ancient Sparta and Athens are really rather stark. Spartans are going to deal with change in a chaotic world through the iron fist, and Athenians themselves are going to deal with change in a chaotic world through democratic principles and the arts. Now, prior to ending the first part of this two-part lecture in the Greek world here, we'll turn next in part 2 to the creation of this Delian League. We'll talk about the Peloponnesian War, which is where these Greek city-states are going to throw down with one another. Athens is going to lead one group of states against Sparta, who is going to have another group of states with them, and then get into Alexander the Great himself. I wanted to talk a little bit about some commonalities or military innovations that we see created in the Greek world itself. One of the biggest threats to the Greek city-states themselves from the outside world were the Persians. Now, we didn't really get into this when we talked about ancient Persia. I mostly spent time, rightfully, talking about Cyrus the Great. But I also mentioned behind Cyrus the Great there was Cambyses. Cambyses went in and conquered Egypt. And then there was Darius and Xerxes. Darius and Xerxes are the individuals that are going to look to try to conquer the Greek world. And the Greeks are going to have a problem here. They are numerically way outnumbered by the Persians. Therefore, if you're going to fight on land, how in the blue blazes am I going to go ahead and be able to match Persian power, manpower, toe for toe? The Greeks then will decide to create this new hoplite, a new infantryman, and a new formation known as the phalanx. One of Sun Tzu's great maxims of war is this: know thy enemy, know thyself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril. For the Greeks, they understood who the Persians were. They have more men than we do. How do we fight that? Their men are armed with short swords. Let's move in a different direction. Thus, in addition to creating larger, heavier shields known as aspis or hoplons, they also created these really long spears known as sarissas. Armed with these new innovations, they were packed together in a different formation known as a phalanx. 16 wide, 16 deep, 256 men, like a freaking human walking tank. This is what the Persians were going to face. The impact of these new innovations, the hoplons, the sarissas, and the new formations like the phalanx, on the Persians was enormous. Persians are used to fighting with short swords against a few lines of opposing infantry. They go in and they break up the opposing infantry's line, and the units are routed and they win the day. Against the Greeks, however, this is new. Not only are they facing this new psychological phenomenon, which is 16 layers of men deep, they can't even get at the front line of the Greek infantry because their short swords are so much shorter than these very long sarissas. It's almost like a boxer that has a shorter reach against another boxer with a longer reach. The boxer with the longer reach can jab the ever-living daylights out of the shorter boxer and win the fight. And this is precisely what will happen in the Greek and Persian wars. Another military enhancement or innovation associated with the Greek world is this trireme. Now, while we'll spend more time talking about the trireme once we get to ancient Rome, especially during these Punic Wars where it's at war against Carthage, I wanted to mention specifically the Athenian Themistocles here. Themistocles was really instrumental in developing a huge navy. The idea being another way to limit the impact of the Persian army is to kill it at sea before it gets here. And the Athenian leadership in construction of a navy was instrumental in helping win these Persian wars as well. That's all for part 1 of this lecture. We'll turn next to the Delian League, Peloponnesian War, and Alexander the Great. Dr. JC out.